So I recently finished this book, Philip and Alexander by Adrian Goldsworthy, and I found it to be such an interesting and compelling tale that not a lot of people are familiar with. And it's the story of these two individuals, these two kings, so Philip II and then his son Alexander the Great, who totally change the history of the world and how their actions lay at the basis of Western civilization. And it's a story that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. And I think one of the most important elements, and this is something that Goldsworthy understands well and incorporates into his book, is that to really understand the story of Alexander the Great, you have to include the story of his father, and that's the part that's omitted. And it's this story of how Macedon, which was the kingdom that the two of them ruled over, started as this backwater, as this backward country on the edge of Greece. It was considered barely Greek, it was like this half barbaric realm. And how Macedon went on not only to unify Greece, but to conquer the civilized world in a really short window of time. So I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the politics. I'm going to talk about the personalities of Philip and Alexander, and they were very different temperamentally, and that played a huge role in this. This was an extremely fast process. So the rise of Macedon, it starts as this, backwater, on the fringes of Greece, bordering, the Thracians and the Illyrians, these barbarian peoples in the north. And then within about 30 years, it goes on to become this sort of huge, empire. And so this happens really fast. So Philip comes to the throne in his 20s, and then he dies in his 40s. Alexander comes to the throne when he's 20, and then he dies when he's 33. So it's basically a generation. It's basically 30 years, and they have this tremendous, huge accomplishment. So a bit of background before we get into the tale here. So prior to the ancient Greeks, prior to the Romans, there's a whole history of the ancient world that precedes them. And so this is a history of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Phoenicia. And around 500 BC, there's this huge transformation of antiquity, and it's the rise of the first, as we call them, universal empire in history. And this happens under the king of Persia, Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus was from Persis or Persia, so to kind of show you on sort of the modern world map. So this is where Persia proper was located in antiquity. And then the northern part of modern day Iran, this was called Media. And then Iraq, this was Babylon. And then the northern part of Iraq, this would have been Assyria. The coast of Lebanon, this would have been Phoenicia. And Cyrus, we call him an Achaemenid. He's named after his grandfather, Achaemenes. When he's young, he inherits Media to the north from his grandfather. And then his reign is the tale of this spectacular rise to power. He goes to war with Lydia. So if you go to modern day Anatolia, there was this very wealthy kingdom called Lydia, which was ruled over by a king named Croesus, who goes to war with Cyrus. And then Croesus is defeated, and Cyrus incorporates Lydia into Persia. And he also, supported by the the nobles of Babylon who don't like their ruler, who found him very unpopular, Cyrus also goes into Babylon and he overthrows the Babylonian Empire. And so this huge expanse of territory is all incorporated into the Persian Empire. And Cyrus was the model in antiquity of a just king, of what a king should be. The Greeks, so once we get into sort of the Greek part of the story here, which we will momentarily, the Greeks didn't like the Persians. The Persians will try to conquer Greece and they'll cause a lot of destruction in Greece. But there was an exception to this, is that they admired the original founder of the Persian Empire. They admired Cyrus. One of the Greek writers, one of the students of Socrates, Xenophon, he writes about Cyrus and uses him as a model of kingship, as a good king. And then Alexander the Great himself really admired Cyrus. And so Cyrus was actually his, exemplar of how he should rule. And so Alexander had these two heroes. He admired Cyrus, the original founder of the Persian Empire, and then he also admired Achilles. And you can see in his life how he's trying to emulate these two figures. Cyrus, he was a famously clement ruler. So, for example, Croesus, who declared war on him, he doesn't put him to death. He actually pardons him, and then eventually Croesus becomes his counselor and assists Cyrus in governing this Persian Empire. And then Cyrus is known for liberating the Jews, right, who had been enslaved in Babylon. He's known for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And then he's also known for this artifact, which is called the Cyrus Cylinder. And this was a discovery associated with his reign, and it records the rights of his subjects. And then a big theme is that Cyrus had this policy of religious liberty. So he didn't compel, the worship of, the Persian gods, of the Zoroastrian gods, but he allowed his subjects to each practice their own religion. While Persia is rising and it's creating this universal empire, in the Greek world you have the rise of the Hellenes as an ethnic group, and then you have the rise of the city-states. If you know anything about the geography of Greece, it's very rocky, it's very mountainous, it's dominated by water and coastline. There's not a lot of land to cultivate and to urbanize, and the physical barriers of the mountains separating one region from another made the political unification of Greece very difficult. So Greece divided into these city-states that were all jealous of each other, that were fiercely independent, and this psychology of the Greeks, this stubborn psychology, in part it's a product of the geography. And then, in addition, this idea of a lack of space in Greece meant that as the population grew, the Greeks needed more places for habitation. So this started this policy where the different city-states would engage in this process of colonization throughout the Mediterranean. And so many Greeks left and they colonized the western coast of Anatolia, they colonized southern Italy, and they created all these city-states and trading centers all throughout the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea. So the Greeks, after engaging in this process of colonization, they have this period in which they're really flourishing. Society is developing, the economy is developing, and they develop this really fantastic intellectual culture with a lot of innovations and achievements. And if you look at the different academic schools, academic disciplines, whether it's math or literature, or the sciences or the arts. Um, Everything tends to have an ancient Greek thinker at the beginning of it. And then in this particular period, in sort of the age of Cyrus, this is the age of what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers. So a couple of famous ones. You have Democritus, who's associated with atomic theory, and then Parmenides is this other pre-Socratic philosopher. And then if you think, how today we say, matter is neither created or destroyed, he's echoing these similar sentiments, these similar ideas, and then he becomes a big influence later on Plato. Who are the major city-states in this period of the history of Greece? So in Sicily, Syracuse is one of them. It's the home of Archimedes. In Asia Minor, so the western coast of Anatolia, Miletus, Ephesus. So these are some of the big cities there. And then in Greece proper, Athens and Sparta. And these two city-states, they were very different. They developed very different identities. Athens was famous for developing a democracy. It was famous for its navy. It was famous for being very learned. And then it was also famous for developing this empire of trade. Sparta was very different from Athens. It had this thing called the Diarchy. It had two kings who governed together. It was really governed by this conservative legislature of elders, which is called the Gerousia. And then Sparta is famous for this military culture that it had. They didn't have walls around their city. Their citizens shared resources, tried to share everything equally amongst the men. And then they kept in permanent subordination a population that were called the helots, or the slaves. So if we get back to our tale of Persia, after Cyrus reigned and took over Anatolia, he was ultimately succeeded by Darius, who's the next major Persian monarch. And among the populations that come under their control, we call them the Ionian Greeks. And so these are the Greeks who live on the western coastline and accepted the sovereignty of Persia. The Greeks were fiercely independent. They had this very stubborn, defiant culture, and they rise in a revolt against the Persian governor. And this revolt against Persia, this is the beginning of the centuries-long rivalry between the Greeks and the Persians. Ultimately, this revolt is suppressed, it's put down, but it really tarnished the prestige of the Persian Empire. And the Persians want to punish the Greeks and those who supported the Greeks of Asia Minor in this revolt. And among the city-states that interfered in this was Athens. And so what the Persians do is they prepare this naval force, and they disembark, and they plan to attack Athens or destroy Athens, and as a punishment to show that you can't interfere with the internal politics of Persia, especially if you're just a city or a city-state. And so this is one of the famous upsets of history, and so this is one of the events that's seen as the beginning of Western civilization. So the Persians, they have this large force, they come with a fleet, they disembark on the coast, so this is north of Athens itself. And the Athenian general, he's sort of assessing the situation, and it's a really bad situation. And so he decides to just make this bold charge as the Persians are trying to come off their ships, and it works. And they actually defeat the Persians retreat, and then they sail back to Persia. And so this is something that sort of draws the attention of the world, and everyone's really stunned and surprised. How can this universal empire, this huge power of Persia, be defeated by this tiny city-state in a battle? So it's really humiliating for the Persians and their prestige. And so it starts this idea of exceptionalism, of Athenian exceptionalism, of Greek exceptionalism. So this question, why is everyone conquered by Persia except for the Greeks? And then famously, when they win the battle, the runner runs back to Athens with the news, and this is where running the marathon comes from. Okay, so after this battle, the next major ruler of Persia, Xerxes, he's really slighted and humiliated that the Athenians were able to accomplish this. And so he decides he's going to launch an invasion and subordinate Greece and bring Greece under Persian control. So we get this story, and it comes to us from the first historian in history, who's Herodotus. And so the Persians, they would go to different states and they would ask for a tribute. They would ask for, quote, earth and water. And that would signify your state accepting subordination to the Persian ruler. The states in northern Greece, so Macedon is actually one of them. There's not a whole lot they can do. The Persians come with an overwhelming, just numerical superiority, so a lot of them accept subordination to Persian rule. However, the city-states in southern Greece are more defiant. And then one of the things that is in their favor is geography, is the really difficult terrain and sort of mountainous geography of Greece. And so their hope is they can use that as an advantage to resist the Persians. So the Greek city-states, who usually would never work together or unify, the fear of being destroyed by the Persians brings the city-states together, and they create this coalition to oppose the invasion. As I mentioned in the video where I talk about tarot cards, the Greeks consult the Oracle of Delphi, who was this famous fortune teller, the priestess of Apollo in ancient Greece, and they ask her for advice. And so she gives these two prophecies. She says to the Spartans, either the king or the city will be torn limb from limb. So this creates this idea, amongst the Spartans, that the king is supposed to make this, sacrifice, and it will actually spare Sparta itself if he does this. And then she says to the Athenians, either the city or the people will be destroyed. So the Athenians make the decision to evacuate Athens. They create a navy. They put their people on the sea. The city is destroyed by the Persians, but then they go on to have this great sea victory. So the Persians invade Greece, and there are these famous battles that occur during this. So the most famous one is, we call it the Battle of the 300 Spartans, or the Battle of Thermopylae. So it's this narrow pass when you're trying to get into southern Greece, where the numerical advantage of the Persians is totally diminished. And so a small force of Spartans and other Greeks held this pass for a really extended period of time, and this bought time for the other Greeks to prepare and sort of develop a response when the Persians arrived in the south. Another famous battle, so there's the Battle of Salamis, which is a sea battle, and it was a similar idea where the numerically superior Persian navy is lured into this bay or this gulf where they're not able to take full advantage of their advantage in numbers. And the Athenians defeat them at sea, and this was really crucial because the Persians had such a large land force that they needed the navy to supply them. So with their fleet destroyed, it was one of the factors forcing the Persians to withdraw. And then eventually the Persians will try to invade the Peloponnese proper. And then there's this huge battle, it's called the Battle of Plataea, where they actually defeat the Persians on land. And so this is the event, this is sort of the turning point in this. We call this the Greco-Persian War, and then this forces the Persians to withdraw and go back to Persia. So after this invasion, Persian power recedes. They become much more internally focused. They won't attempt to conquer Greece or subordinate Greece again. And instead, now Athens and Sparta, who were the two allies in this war, they are ascendant and they become really renowned throughout the ancient world. And what they end up doing is they create their own empires or their own alliances. So what the Athenians do is it's called the Delian League. And so all the different islands and sort of the city-states of the Aegean, they initially come together in this alliance as a defensive agreement against Persia. And then over time, the Athenians come to economically dominate this, and it becomes de facto an empire of Athens. And then similarly, Sparta created this series of alliances in the Peloponnese. And the same thing, so Sparta doesn't rule over its allies directly, but de facto it's kind of like an empire of Sparta. And as time goes forward and as Persia becomes less and less of a threat, there's a falling out between Athens and Sparta, and the two develop a rivalry. One of the major events in the escalation of this rivalry is the Athenians build these walls. They're called the Long Walls, which connect the inland, city of Athens itself, on the Acropolis, and its port, which is called the Piraeus. One of the other early historians of history, alongside Herodotus, is Thucydides. And so Thucydides gives us this narrative of how things are gradually escalating between Sparta and Athens, how Athens builds the long walls, and then he explains the process of the falling out getting worse, it becoming this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, this mutual suspicion grows more and more, and finally you have this war which breaks out, which we call the Peloponnesian War. And the Peloponnesian War, it's really interesting if you compare it to maybe more modern conflicts like the Cold War. In many ways, the war was a stalemate. It's just sort of the nature of the two powers and their different strengths and what they were adapted to. So the Athenians had this great navy and they controlled the sea, and the Spartans had this superior land army which would win on land. And every season, every campaigning season, the Spartans would go to Attica, they would besiege Athens, but then the Athenians would be able to supply, through the Piraeus and the Long Walls, they would be able to keep Athens supplied, and then the Spartans would have to withdraw, by the time the harvest came, and it was this sort of stalemate. And instead, these proxy states, these different islands and city-states, is where a lot of the fighting and political change happened. And the shifting alliances, some city-states would defect to Athens, some would defect to Sparta. And so this was the narrative of the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans, they had this great military culture. They were extremely distinguished on the battlefield. After the Battle of Thermopylae, they developed this mythology of being invincible, of being unbeaten on the battlefield. Um, at the same time, they didn't have a navy. They only develop a navy late in the Peloponnesian War, and that's going to be one of the factors that lets them win the war. And the other thing is they had this disdain, for economics and for trade. And so the Athenians were vastly richer, had a much greater economy. And so they were able to maintain their empire and continue to trade and continue to sort of prosper and develop, even while this war was going on. And what ends up happening is Sparta didn't so much win as the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War. They make this decision to attack Syracuse, which is this very distant, friendly city-state to Sparta in Sicily. And so Syracuse, it was founded by Doric Greeks, so it was ethnically the same as Sparta. But at the time the Athenians do this expedition, Syracuse has no relationship. They're not a part of the Peloponnesian War. So they draw in this extra power, which they didn't have to do. They think they'll take Syracuse and it'll be this great, military accomplishment. They dedicate a huge amount of resources to this, and they basically lose everything, and it's a disaster. And so what ends up happening is then the Spartans, they take advantage of this. They besiege Athens, and Athens falls, and they end up losing the Peloponnesian War. If you think about this from an analytical perspective, Athens was a democracy. Sparta had this much more conservative constitution with the two kings and the Gerousia. It shows that a democracy can be more volatile, it can be more unstable, and it's not necessarily the superior form of government when you're engaged in this type of war. So the Athenians, so they fall due to this, foolish blunder, and Sparta, in contrast, has this long, Sparta won't have this one spectacular moment where it goes away, but instead it's this sort of long, slow decline over time from their arch conservatism, from being too conservative and from failing to reform. Could the Athenians have won the Peloponnesian War? So a different policy for them, don't do this expedition to Syracuse. One of the weaknesses of Sparta is the helots, is the slaves, which the Spartans were always very paranoid about. So if the Athenians took advantage of their navy, if they supported these rebellions, if they maintained their economic superiority while chipping away at Sparta's alliances, there is a different vision here where the Athenians could have won this war. And then a huge disaster for Athens, in one of the sieges where the Spartans surrounded the city, a plague broke out in Athens, and they lost Pericles, who was this great leader to them. And so without that leadership, they didn't have the guidance to lead them through this war. So after Sparta captures Athens, this is the period where the Spartans become the hegemon of Greece and sort of dominate Greece. They install this regime in Athens that's called the 30 Tyrants, who were these really draconian, cruel rulers, and they do all these prescriptions and put all these people to death. And then as a leader of Greece, Sparta was really bad in this role and became very unpopular. It was difficult to challenge them because people were very intimidated by how powerful their military was. But ultimately, one of the city-states, Thebes, which was north of Athens, challenged the Spartans in battle, and they defeated them. And so this is the period just before the reign of Philip, where Thebes becomes this leading power in Greece. So to start on Macedon, Macedon was in northern Greece. It was on the border or the fringes of the Greek worlds and the barbarian worlds. And the Macedonians were looked down upon. They were viewed as backward. They were viewed as not having really accomplished much in their history or having accomplished anything. They had a very simple government. They were governed by a monarchy. And that was also something that the southern Greeks looked down upon. So the Athenians and the Corinthians and the Thebans and these other city-states, they had these complex governments, these complex constitutions, and Macedon was just, they had a king. And so that was another reason that they were looked down upon. There are these different interpretations. So like one way of looking at it is that the Argeads, which is the name of the dynasty who ruled Macedon, were sometimes viewed as ethnically Greek, and they get this name because they came from Argos in the Peloponnese, in their mythology of how they came to rule Macedon. So sometimes it's the ruling family was Greek, but the people of Macedon themselves were not Greek. There was this famous controversy in the Olympics, the early, ancient Olympic Games, where the Macedonians wanted to participate and the other Greek city-states protested and didn't want to allow them. And then the Argeads used this claim of their ancestry to at least allow the royal family themselves to participate in the Olympic Games. If you look at the origins of Macedon, this original capital of Aegae, which was the name, the place of goats. This was the original capital of the kingdom. And then they later moved it to Pella, which just means stone. And it's just sort of interesting and kind of poetic that it really shows the humble origins of this kingdom. Geographically, it's located in this very fertile alluvial plain, and there was space in Macedon for development and agriculture and urbanization, which was an advantage that it actually had over southern Greece, where there were a lot more physical limits. There wasn't space to grow the population of the city-states. And then a major resource of Macedon was timber, and so they had these vast forests, and a big buyer of this timber was Athens, who used it to build their fleet. And then another strength of Macedon is horses. And so in southern Greece, they had these hoplite armies, these infantry armies. But in northern Greece, you had Thessaly and Macedon, and they raised horses, and they had cavalry, which they integrated into their militaries as a part of this. Okay, so finally getting to the story of Philip here. So he comes to the throne. He'll rule Macedon around 350 BC. He starts his tale, in his youth. When we first get a record of him, he's a captive. He's sort of a guest in Thebes while his brother is the king. And when he's in Thebes, he has the opportunity to observe the Theban military, which at the time was the most exceptional in Greece, and it was called the Sacred Band. And this is one of the things that has a huge impact on his life. And he watches the Greek phalanx, and he watches how they cooperate, and they're constantly drilling, constantly training. He looks at how they use their shields and how the way they fight together, they're protecting each other on the battlefield. And he notices that the more they train and the more disciplined they are, the fewer casualties they suffer. And so while he's here in Thebes watching them drill, he has this really simple, almost childlike idea. What if they had the longest spears? And it's a very simple minded thought, but it's going to actually be the basis of a military revolution. And so he's going to take this and he's going to take what he learned from watching the Thebans, and he's going to incorporate it into his own military when he rules Macedon. He goes back north, and he learns that his brother, who's named Perdiccas, has died in battle. And the king of the Illyrians, Bardalus, who was this barbarian ruler, was invading Macedon, was taking territory from Macedon, and killed his brother on the battlefield. And this was happening simultaneous to these other barbarian peoples, so we call them the Paeonians, and the Thracians are attacking Macedon as well. And then at the same time, the Athenians, who would often interfere in the internal politics of Macedon, are supporting these pretenders to come in and take over the throne and take over Macedon. The Athenians, they were a democracy, but they also engaged in this policy of imperialism. And Macedon was often in this subordinate role as a puppet of the other powers. So he's 20, his brother's just died, and so Macedon is in this huge, massive internal crisis. So Macedon is in the midst of this huge crisis, and the assembly decides to make Philip the king. And he's just a very interesting figure to study the history of. He was a great diplomat, so he was great at negotiating with people, and that was his accomplishment that he was the most proud of himself personally, was his ability to have these relationships with people and with different powers. And at the start of his reign, he's really beginning from this point of weakness, and so he has to use diplomacy, he has to use appeasement simply to survive as a state. But as Macedon grows stronger, he's able to add strength to strength, and then he transitions seamlessly out of being this sort of subordinate power to being, a more significant power, to being a major power, to ultimately becoming the hegemon and the leader of Greece. Philip, okay, so just to sort of back up for a minute here, the Macedonian monarchs, they practice polygamy, so they would have multiple wives, and Philip uses marriage as a major tool to secure alliances, to negotiate with his neighbors, and to advance his power. And so he starts his reign, and he marries the daughter of this barbarian king Bardalus. And so this appeases him. This gives some legitimacy to the Illyrians, and so it stabilizes the relationship when Philip is first becoming the king and trying to consolidate his power. So once he's the king, his big innovation is going to be in the world of the military. And so what he does is he takes the levies, the sort of peasant levies, the farmer levies of Macedon, and he transforms them into a standing army, into a salaried army. One of the things ancient militaries would do is they would sort of privatize a lot of aspects of the military to the citizens themselves, and so they would have to bring their own weapons and their own equipment. So he changes this, and so they're going to be full-time, paid for by the state, and then equipped and armed by the state. And then he devotes himself to drilling the infantry, drilling the new phalanx of Macedon endlessly. And then his really huge transformation is he's going to equip them with this extremely long spear, which is called the sarissa. And so the sarissa was anywhere, it was 12 to 20 feet long, and this is twice as long as the spears that were commonly used in southern Greece. Now, the spear was so long that it was really unwieldy, and it required a lot of training to be able to use this weapon. And then the length of the spear also means that they can't have the huge shields that were iconic to the hoplites. So instead, they have to have these small shields, almost bucklers, instead. But they had such length with the sarissa that as long as the Macedonian phalanx worked together and cooperated, they would effectively outrange their enemies on the battlefield. And the sarissa themselves, they could, hold them up, and it would actually prevent arrow fire. And if they fought disorganized enemies on the battlefield, if they fought barbarian armies, oftentimes the sarissa would have very few or wouldn't have any casualties. So the phalanx, this becomes the essential core aspect of the Macedonian military, is this innovation of Philip. Other things that he incorporates, he tries to build a relationship with the nobles of Macedon. He begins to bring the sons of the Macedonian nobility to court with him at Pella, and they're in these court schools. And then the nobles of Macedon make up the cavalry, the heavy cavalry, which we call the companions. And so the Macedonians, to kind of show you this image here, they created this military tactic, which in many ways was very simple, but allowed them to dominate the battlefield. And so we call it the hammer and anvil. And so the powerful sarissa was the anvil, and it would pin the enemy formation in place. And then the hammer would be the companion cavalry, would come around the flank, come around the back, and sort of smash them from behind. And so the combination of these two elements will let Philip and then Alexander after him win battle after battle. And other armies that didn't integrate cavalry, that didn't have as talented an infantry as the Macedonians, they weren't able to stand up to this. Philip develops relationships with the nobles of Macedon. So the older generation, one of his big supporters is Parmenion, and then another important supporter is Antipater. And then as Macedon begins to rise, then you'll have this younger generation. So these are more of the peers of Alexander. And so some of the famous ones, you have Hephaestion, who was Alexander the Great's, battle brother and his closest friend. And then Ptolemy is another famous younger Macedonian as well. There was a weakness to the sarissa, which it was slow, and then it had this vulnerability on the flanks. So what Philip did to make up for this is he had the most elite soldiers made up what were called the silver shields, and he put them on either side of the flanks, and they would guard the sides of the sarissa from attack. And then another policy of Philip, as he fought enemies on the battlefield who were talented and skilled, he would integrate them into his army as well, and in this way adding strength to strength as Macedon grew. So to sort of characterize Philip's personality politically, he was very cautious. He tried to cultivate this image of himself of not being a tyrant, of not being tyrannical with power. He tried to be diplomatic. He tried to become a hegemon, but he didn't try to dominate others or overpower others or infringe on the liberties of others. And this policy was very prudent and very intelligent, and it was a key aspect of his success was the manner in which he conducted himself as he grew as a king. Oftentimes he would try not to be the direct attacker or aggressor in a war, but instead he would try to intervene and defend other parties in a war, and then sort of take advantage of the settlement or the peace agreement that would come as a consequence of a war. As we said, these marriage alliances were a huge aspect of his power. So after he marries Bartolus' daughter, his next wife is a noblewoman from Upper Macedon. And so what probably happened here is that Macedon had politically devolved over the years and under a series of weak monarchs, weak kings, and he wanted Upper Macedon to come back into the fold and come back under his influence. So it seems that he married one of the daughters of one of the leading families, and that was the purpose of this marriage, was to, sort of to reintegrate them back into the kingdom. After a year of truce with Bartolus, he goes to war with him again. He retakes these lands in Upper Macedon that were lost to the Illyrians. He uses the reformed army to do this, and so this gives Macedon its sort of political place back and its political dignity back. If you look at the map, one of the advantages of Macedon is it's able to expand. It's in this good location and it has this favorable geography compared to the city-states of southern Greece. Macedon, to its north, it had all these barbarian states, and it was able to expand at their expense and urbanize and grow its population, whereas the southern Greeks were much more confined by their geography. Macedon was also in this advantageous location where it could, if it chose to, go into southern Greece and intervene or interfere in the politics there if it wanted to. So he spends a lot of his reign fighting the Paeonians, fighting the Illyrians, fighting the Thracians, fighting all these different northern tribes, turning them either into subjects of Macedon or turning them into allies of Macedon. His big move that will really change Macedon's place politically is he'll attack this Greek city-state on the coast, which is called Amphipolis. And Amphipolis was a former Athenian colony. Athens lost it after the Peloponnesian War. And Amphipolis was built on the side of a mountain which had this huge silver deposit. And Philip really wants access to those resources. So he already has his reformed military, so now he's going to get involved in siege warfare, and so he hires all these engineers, and they besiege the city. The Athenians take an interest in this, and it's their former colony, and what he does is he deceives them, and he says, I'm going to give Amphipolis back to Athens after I take it. And so he is very crafty here, and so he prevents Athens from helping Amphipolis in resisting him, and then once he takes the city, he keeps it for himself. He also, after the siege of Amphipolis, he'll found this city, which is called Philippi, and so this will be an inspiration for Alexander and for the Alexandrias, and then he brings all these Macedonian colonists in as well. And so this region of Amphipolis is going to be a huge source of silver and wealth that he's going to use to fund his military. The success at Amphipolis and this betrayal of Athens, though, wins Philip an enemy, and this will be a lifelong enemy of his, and it's this Athenian statesman and public speaker, and he's named Demosthenes. And he's later famed for these series of speeches. They're called the Philippics that he gives in the assembly in Athens. And it's these tirades criticizing Philip, saying that he's a tyrant, that he's a danger to Greece, he's going to take over Greece, he's going to take our liberties, and that Athens should be the leader in opposing the expansion of Macedon. Philip, as I said, his personality, his temperament, how diplomatic he was. So we have these accounts where he always actually tried to be gracious to Demosthenes and win him over. But he was never successful at reconciling Demosthenes to him. After the success at Amphipolis, Philip will go to war and try to take these cities on the coast to the south of Macedon. And in one famous incident, he's besieging the city of Macedon. And while this is going on, he gets shot in the eye with an arrow. And this is a really grievous injury, and it almost kills him. He does survive. He does recover from the wound, but it does permanently disfigure him. And so he was this, handsome ruler previously, and it makes him into this, very unattractive visage. And then Demosthenes would mock Philip for the rest of his life, and he would call him the Cyclops, the one-eyed, giving him this monstrous characterization for the rest of his reign. So after this success, after consolidating Macedon, Philip turns his attention south. And to the south of Macedon, there's this kingdom called Thessaly, or this region called Thessaly. And it was divided amongst these different noble families. And a good way to think of it is to think of, Romeo and Juliet and how the families were always feuding with one another. This characterized Thessaly very well. There were these two big cities. One was called Pherae, and the other was called Larissa. And they had this long rivalry of fighting with one another. He will marry the daughter of the leader of Pherae. Then he'll use his now very, substantial military, and he'll intervene in the internal politics. In doing so, he'll hand power over to the people of Pherae. Then later on, he's going to try to mediate and sort of bring peace to the region. So he marries another noblewoman from the city of Larissa. And after he does this, and he's acting as sort of a diplomatic mediator and sort of resolving these internal disputes in the region, they end up making him the archon, right, the leader of Thessaly. And so this was a huge expansion of Macedon's power, and this huge geographic expansion as well. And so this fertile, populous region comes under the control of Macedon. And then he has a daughter, Thessaloniki, who he names, which her name means victory in Thessaly, to commemorate the success that he had here. And then today we have the city of Thessalonica in Greece, and it's actually named after Philip's daughter. So Philip's most famous wife, his next wife, is Olympias, and so this is his first sort of royal marriage that he has. So she is the daughter of the king of Epirus, and then she's also going to give birth to Alexander, who ends up being Philip's heir and successor. This was another way of expanding his power. So he's used force to defeat the barbarians to the north. He's taken over all these local cities, and he's used diplomacy to take over Thessaly, and now he's going to use marriage to get another ally or to expand his power further in Epirus. He'll install Olympias' brother as the king of Epirus, and so Epirus will be, not directly under his control, but this key and, long-term ally of Macedon. Olympias herself, she's very shrewd, she's very political, she's very mystical. Um, in the accounts of her and of their marriage, so she was initially infatuated with Philip, but then she starts to grow jealous of him and then starts to grow resentful of him, and it it was likely his constant philandering that alienated her and turned her against him. And so this is going to be, so as we get more into sort of Philip's character, one of his weaknesses were these constant love affairs, and it's actually these love affairs that become his undoing. So Olympias' son, Alexander, he's going to sort of be groomed into the natural successor of Philip. Philip did have an older son, Philip Archidaeus, but he was mentally unfit. So he was unable to rule in his own right for that reason. Alexander was trained in the military. He's very politically competent, and so he sort of becomes the heir. The two had very different personalities. One of the big differences between them is Philip is very much a philanderer. He's very polyamorous, and then Alexander, just in the accounts, he just doesn't have these types of promiscuous love affairs. Both of them, they liked alcohol. That was Alexander's preferred vice. And then another difference, more of an aesthetic difference. Philip wore his beard, like the traditional Greeks, and then Alexander is the beginning of this style of being clean shaven, which will become popularized after his reign. Philip will hire Aristotle, who was a student of Plato. Aristotle was a Macedonian himself, and so he becomes the tutor of Alexander. And he taught him ethics, and he taught him politics, and he taught him the Iliad. And then Alexander keeps his copy of the poem with him his whole life. We don't have a lot of direct knowledge of what happened here, and so what their lessons were like. Alexander did go to school with Hephaestion, and then Hephaestion becomes his close friend his whole life as a product of this. And the two of them had this relationship, if you ever read the Iliad, like Achilles and Patroclus. And so that was how Alexander viewed his friend, as sort of his battle brother, his blood brother. As Philip matures, and so he's achieved this sort of hegemonic status already, in his mature reign, he's going to intervene in a conflict, and we call it the Sacred War. And so this had been a war that had been going on for years, and it involved basically all the minor powers of Greece. And the Sacred War was this dispute over who was the custodian of the Oracle of Delphi. And what Philip will do is he'll intervene, and he'll oppose Phocas, which was this upstart power that had basically occupied and taken over the sanctuary of the Oracle of Delphi. And after defeating Phocas, this is going to be another huge victory for him that's really going to advance the position of Macedon, and really intimidate the southern Greeks and show them that Macedon is a real danger to them militarily. There's this one anecdote which it sort of shows the sort of comic, crafty personality of Philip. They're fighting the Phocians, and they're very pious, and so they don't want to go to war with anyone who is sacred to Apollo. So he has his soldiers wear laurel crowns, laurel wreaths on the battlefield. And so this is one of the origin stories of where the laurel crown for the Greek kings comes from, is this anecdote of Philip in the Sacred War. So after the Sacred War, Philip is close to being the hegemon of Greece, and this causes this sort of wave of fear to go through the city-states. So the two leading cities, Athens and Thebes, create a military alliance to actively oppose him. And so they confront him in this battle, which is called Chaeronea in southern Greece. Alexander, by this point, is 18. He leads the charge of the cavalry, and he distinguishes himself. And so Philip defeats these cities, and after this battle, there's really nothing that could stop him if he wanted to physically conquer and take of Greece, and take Greece for himself. But instead, what he does from this position of strength is he comes up with this interesting contrivance. And so this is one of his proudest achievements, and it's called either the Hellenic League or it's called the League of Corinth. And it's one of the things, when I learned the history of Philip, I found most fascinating. And it was a way for him to unify Greece while letting the city-states keep their independence, keep their liberties, not interfere with their internal politics. So it's a good compromise between the jealous Greeks who didn't want to be dominated by others, but at the same time, unifying Greece, under one power for the first time. So the Hellenic League, all of the city-states, they enter into an alliance with Macedon alone. Macedon will not interfere with their internal politics, so they still have their constitutions. The Athenians still have their assembly. They still have their, elected leaders. But it's a way of sort of de facto unifying all the Greeks under Philip's rule. So he becomes the hegemon, and he creates this organization with the idea that now the Greeks will all be unified, and they'll go on a campaign against Persia, who was this sort of hated enemy who was always sort of there in the background. And at the time, there were these figures, we call them the Pan-Hellenists, and they wanted the Greeks to unify and not be constantly bickering with each other. So Philip is the first person to really accomplish this. After this, Philip will visit the Oracle of Delphi, and he does this seeking guidance about his campaign into Persia. And so he gets this prophecy from her, and she says, allegedly, the bull is ready, the sacrifice prepared. And he interprets this as a good omen, that he should do an animal sacrifice, that he can embark on his campaign against Persia, and he views it as a good omen. Around this time, however, is when Philip's personality begins to change, and it begins to become a problem for him. So he was a famous philanderer. He had all these different love affairs with men and with women, and it becomes a cause of dissolution to him. And then alcohol as well starts to really dominate him in a way it didn't in his youth. He has this love affair with one of his bodyguards named Pausanias. And then after this, he spurns Pausanias and puts him to one side. And this is going to be the event that causes Philip's downfall. After spurning Pausanias, he starts another affair with a nobleman in Macedon named Attalus. And Attalus doesn't come off very well in the history. He comes off as this very selfish, self-interested individual. And he has this sort of complicated sex scheme where he's sleeping with Philip, and then his niece Eurydice is going to marry Philip and also be sleeping with him as well. And it's this idea to basically use sex to control the king, and then Eurydice would give birth to a son, and then the idea is this son would then displace Alexander as the new ruler of Macedon. To make the situation worse, Attalus comes off as pretty cruel, and so he uses his position as Philip's lover to basically, push his weight around at court. and he has his friends sexually assault Pausanias and sort of humiliate him in front of everyone. And then Pausanias will go to Philip and he'll ask for justice, but then Philip can't punish Attalus because he's too powerful, and then he makes him the commander of the expedition against Persia. And then this is going to be one of the factors that causes Philip's downfall. So this sort of court intrigue and Philip being kind of manipulated by Attalus, the situation gets worse and the things escalate. So there's this scene where Philip is drunk and there's this big confrontation at court, and he's kind of insulting Alexander, who up until this point had been his heir, and he seems to be he's suggesting that he's going to disinherit him, he's going to have a new son with Eurydice, he doesn't need him, and he's acting in this very imprudent and insensible way, and it is a really big difference from his former prudence and his former personality, which had characterized him for so many years previously. So he's no longer his gracious and diplomatic self in this scene. It's implied there's this danger for Alexander and for Olympias at the court, and they actually flee Macedon and they go to Epirus. And then it puts Alexander of Epirus, who was Olympias' brother, in this really awkward situation, because he got his throne by the grace of Philip, and now he doesn't know if, and basically, Alexander and Olympias are asking him now, go to war with Macedon, and he really doesn't know what to do here. Eventually, Philip does reach out to them, and they do reconcile, and Alexander is sort of affirmed as the heir, and so he returns back to Pella. So this is something that we don't know tons about. We have our best guesses of what happened, and so this is sort of like the colorful, controversial part of the story. You can see, based on what I've said, that there's a lot of scheming, a lot of plotting, there's a lot of intrigue here, and I'm going to tell you our best guess of what happened, but we don't entirely know, and we don't have enough accounts of the narrative to know with certain knowledge of what happened. But you can see the motivations already of the different figures in Philip's assassination. So Pausanias is extremely hurt after being, sort of callously cast aside by Philip, and this sexual humiliation in front of the court, in front of everyone, by Attalus, has basically ruined his life. He is working as one of the bodyguards of Philip. Philip tries to appease him and tries to, ingratiate himself with Pausanias, but this anger that he has, is a huge resentment that he has against the king. Did Pausanias go to Alexander and tell him he was going to confront Philip? So this is one of the theories that might have been true, and so could it be that Alexander could have intervened and prevented this assassination from happening, and he sort of chose not to, had the falling out between him and his father, the relationship between Olympias and Philip gotten so bad by this point that they sort of let Pausanias kill Philip when they could have prevented this. So this is part of the color in trying to figure out or piece together what happened. So what ends up happening is Philip is holding this festival. One of his daughters is getting married. He's also doing this to show his new celebrity and his new prestige as the king and basically the leader of a unified Greece. And he's also using it to prepare people for his invasion of Persia. And as part of this, he wants to show that he's this magnanimous ruler and that he doesn't rule through fear and through force and through domination. So one of the things he does is he goes amidst the crowd, and he goes without his bodyguard. And when he does this, Pausanias, who was one of his bodyguards, runs out and stabs him and kills him. And this is very shocking to everybody. And then Pausanias tries to escape on his horse. And in the process of fleeing, he's caught and he's killed. And so this is, where people speculate. Did he have accomplices? Was he planning to do this and then survive? I mean, he did have the horse. He was trying to escape. Was he funded by Darius, was the new ruler of Persia? Were the Persians partly behind this scheme? Did they pay him? Did they bribe him? Did Alexander know? Did Olympias know? So we have accounts of, after this happening, Olympias going to Pausanias's grave and leaving him offerings. Now, is that just because she and her son personally benefited from his action that she did this, or is it evidence of something more insidious being behind this? Was this an overt scheme by Alexander to get rid of his father? If you look at Goldsworthy, he says no, and I agree with him, no. And the reason for this is the speed with which the military sort of came behind Alexander, and the manner in which the succession transitioned over to him and without controversy. We can make the conclusion that this was not an overt conspiracy by him to kill his father and take the throne. But there's enough color here where we can, speculate on what the real story actually was. One of the things you'll hear from time to time is, should Philip have this title, the Great, just like his son? And based on his accomplishments, you can make a strong argument that he could have been or could get the title of Philip the Great. But his premature death, his undoing, which happens as a result of the sort of sexual philandering, it sort of prevents him from fully completing his legacy. And then his legacy is instead sort of built upon by his son, who we end up giving the title and the credit to. So after the death of Philip, his son Alexander will come to the throne. And who were his idols? He really admired Cyrus, he really admired Achilles, and then he will end up living in the real world, a short, glorious life similar to Achilles. When he starts his reign, there's this sort of background scheme to sort of supplant him and make Archidaeus the ruler, and then they won't have to submit to Alexander's regime. So this is sort of done away with. He gets support from Parmenion, from sort of the older aristocrats and nobles in Macedon. And then after coming to the throne, he'll basically have a purge. And sort of the whole faction behind Attalus and sort of his conspiracy is gotten rid of, is eliminated. At the same time, he's 20, he's a new king, he's young, he's untested, and so there's this ambiguity if a lot of the institutions, a lot of the contrivances in diplomatic arrangements which were created under Philip will continue under Alexander. So one of the things that happens is Athens and Thebes, who are part of the League of Corinth, they start plotting and conspiring and this idea of we can throw off Macedonian rule and we can become independent again. In addition, all these barbarian states to the north of Macedon, which had sort of become subjects of Philip, it's the same thing. So why should we, accept the rule of this, youthful king? So that's one of the things he's forced to do at the start of his reign, is sort of go north and sort of, reconquer the barbarians again. While he's up there and doing this, rumors start in the south that he's actually died on campaign. And Thebes decides to try to throw off, Macedonian rule. And so it rises in a revolt against Macedon. And so this is one of the defining events of Alexander's life, is he responds very quickly and very decisively to this. And if he hadn't done this, Athens would have then joined in the revolt, and then other city-states would have joined in the revolt too, and it could have been an event that would have unraveled the whole kingdom that Philip had established. So he races south, he defeats the Theban army in battle, and then he decides to make an example of Thebes and send a message to the other city-states. So he burns the city to the ground, and then he enslaves the population of the city. And so it shows that, they didn't have the prince, they didn't have Machiavelli, but that this idea of political realism, that the idea, it's better to be feared than loved, was something that they understood even in this time. And so this, instills the fear of consequence in the other city-states, and so they all, submit to Alexander's rule. The Athenians never get to the point where they sort of raise arms and sort of turn against him. And so he decides to forgive them, to acquit them, and he needs their ships for the campaign against Persia, which he does want to do. And so he decides to acquit the Athenians and just move forward. A couple things that he does before embarking to Persia. One thing that makes him very popular in the short term is he abolishes taxes. And the idea here is this will make him popular at home, and that he will use plunder from the campaigns in Persia to basically sustain himself and to sustain his army. And then before leaving to Persia, he visits the Oracle of Delphi, and then this is where he gets the prophecy that, you are invincible. And then it's interesting, if you ever look on Wikipedia, there's this page, and it's all of the, it's a list of all the battles of Alexander the Great, and it's victory, 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 victory. And it is true that he went on to be sort of this unique military commander in history with this type of battle record. Okay, so he leaves Macedon, he crosses the Hellespont, he visits Troy, so the Greeks really, revere the story of the Trojan War, and he makes sacrifices to Zeus and Dionysus, he observes all the pious rituals, and then after crossing the Hellespont, he has his first major battle, and the Macedonians cross this river, and it's called the Granicus. And he does something that would usually be very foolish, and it's something that most commanders in history wouldn't do, and he leads from the front, and he's the first one to charge when they do the cavalry charges. He is almost killed in battle, but his boldness, his audacity, his good fortune, he will win again and again. So this first battle at the Granicus, the Macedonians win, and their superior cavalry, their superior arms prevails against the Persians who come out to meet them. If we talk a little bit about Persia around this time, so in around 300 BC, so it's this vast universal empire, but it's also this sort of aging empire with a lot of internal problems as well. It has this new ruler, Darius III, who's an Achaemenid, but the empire is so large that he's basically forced to delegate administration to these local governors that are called satraps. Prior to Darius, the empire had suffered these years of instability, and one of the things that cause problems. At the height of this regime, there was this eunuch. His name was Bagoas, and it was a controversy. He would murder kings and try to install puppet kings, and then finally, with the rise of Darius, this comes to an end. Darius's personality, he seems to have a gentle nature. He seems to be a lover of pleasure. He did have just vast resources of this huge empire. He had this massive military. In all the fights between Persia and Macedon, the Persians will vastly outnumber them. However, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the military prowess, they don't have the military innovation that the Macedonians have, and so the Macedonians will be outnumbered, and they'll win against these these superior armies again and again. And then another issue with Persia is they had some of these rebellious provinces that didn't necessarily support Persian rule. So Egypt, for example, which had recently revolted, and then the Persians went in and sort of reconquered it, was very unhappy with Persian rule. Babylon as well, was unhappy with being governed by the Persians by this point. And so these will be weaknesses that the Macedonians will take advantage of when they invade the Persian Empire. As Alexander goes into Asia Minor, there were these Greeks who worked for the Persians. And so the most famous of these was the mercenary captain named Memnon. And he had this scheme for how to stop Alexander. And so he looked at the situation and he said, he said Alexander is young, he's unproven, he just abolished taxes back in Macedon. The Macedonian royal family has all these intrigues. It can be very dangerous to be a king of Macedon. You could be assassinated. You could have somebody turn against you, and kill you. And he also had the idea of naval superiority with the Persian fleet, which was another advantage he could use against Alexander. So he knew that Alexander wanted direct battle. He wanted to have these decisive victories to sort of show Macedon's prowess, both to the Greeks and against the Persians. So he comes up with this idea. This is what he proposes to the Persians. We should avoid a direct battle. We should scorch the earth because the Macedonians need plunder and they need the resources of the land to live off of. And fight him in this sort of mode of guerrilla warfare. And then in the history, at least in the accounts that we have, the Persians reject this and they decide instead to fight Alexander in a direct battle, and they lose. And so this is the Battle of the Granicus. As Alexander goes into Asia Minor, he starts to liberate the Greek cities and they come under his control. There is one, so Miletus stays loyal to Persia, and so this is the first siege that he's forced to do. There's a famous story. He reaches the city of Gordion in Anatolia, and there's this knot, and then there was this folklore about the knot that whoever could untie it would rule Asia, and then in the parable he takes out his sword and he cuts it, and so that is sort of him fulfilling this prophecy of becoming the ruler of Asia. He'll pass through this region of Anatolia, which sort of embarks into the Phoenician coast, and they're called the Cilician Gates. And he and Parmenion descend into Phoenicia. And as they do this, Darius finally arrives and comes with the Persian army to confront them. What ends up happening is the baggage train, so under Parmenion, gets separated from Alexander with the main army. And then there's this sort of moment of confusion, and Darius is uncertain, and he thinks he's behind the Greek army, and ultimately they have a confrontation, and so this is sort of the second major battle between them, and this is the Battle of Issus. So at Issus, it was going to be a recurring theme where the Persians will outnumber them, but the power of the Sarissa, the quality of the companions, the aggression, the enthusiasm of the Macedonians, they're going to prevail again and again. So they fight in this sort of narrow strip of land between the coast and the mountains. And the Persians are not able to take full advantage of their numbers on the battlefield. Initially, things go well for the Persians, but then the superior fighting ability of the Macedonians will overcome them. And then a recurring theme, which happens both here and at Gaugamela, is Alexander will sort of wait until Darius is personally exposed on the battlefield, and then he'll charge at him in the center. And then Darius, instead of holding his ground, he'll flee. And then when he flees, it causes this huge lack of morale in his army, and then his army will rout. And he'll lose both battles as a consequence of this, direct attack by the Macedonian king against him. So after this victory at Issus, it's a really huge and sort of transformative event. It proves Alexander's legitimacy to the Greeks, who begin to accept him as this unifier and this sort of sovereign. It adds to his celebrity, it adds to his prestige. Alexander will capture Darius's wife, Statira, and his children as a result of this battle. And then after this victory, he goes south, and the Phoenician cities will start submitting to Alexander's rule. There's this one anecdote which I just enjoy, and they get to one of the cities on the coast in Lebanon, Sidon, and Alexander has Hephaestion determine who should be the king. And so he goes into the gardens, and he finds this old descendant of one of the former rulers, and he decides to make this humble man into the king. It's just a little anecdote that I find interesting. And then another story around this time is Hephaestion goes to Athens, and he reconciles with Demosthenes. So Demosthenes finally becomes reconciled with this idea of a monarchy and with having Alexander as the king. As they go down the coast of Phoenicia, they reach this famous city which is called Tyre. And so this is probably the most fantastic event from the life of Alexander. And Tyre was this huge cosmopolitan city, this extremely rich, populous city. It was the source of Tyrian purple, which was the purple dye that only the very wealthy, richest aristocrats in the world were able to buy. And Tyre was unique because it was this city that was totally disconnected from the mainland. It was on an island to itself, and it was well fortified. So as Alexander goes down the coast, all the cities submit to him except for Tyre. And he can't leave Tyre there because of its navy and the idea that they could use their fleet to basically cut him off from supply. So this is one of the most fantastic events of his reign. And what he does is, initially he doesn't have ships, so he decides to basically extend the land to Tyre and create basically a land bridge or a mole to reach the city. And it shows that this really unique individual, this Alexander the Great, even the physical land, the geography will be molded by the will of this individual. The siege of Tyre is this huge battle, this huge siege. Eventually, he does bring in ships from Greece and from Cyprus who help him, and ultimately he captures the city. And then this battle actually changes the physical geography, and so the mole becomes permanent, and instead of being this coastal city, Tyre becomes a part of this permanent peninsula, attached to the mainland, which it is today. So after the siege of Tyre, again, so the Persians are sort of not responding at this point. There is another siege at Gaza, which is pretty brutal. But after this, the Macedonians make their way to Egypt. And as I mentioned before, Egypt had revolted against Persia. They were very defiant to Persian rule. So when the Macedonians arrive, they actually view them as liberators. And they make Alexander the king, or the pharaoh of Egypt. And the Macedonians spend some time. They sort of like recoup and sort of rest and recover before turning back to their campaigns against Darius. So this is the beginning of Hellenic Egypt, of Greek Egypt, which will continue until the reign of Cleopatra. While in Egypt, Alexander will found Alexandria, which is the most famous of these Greek colonies that he'll found in the east. And then in Egypt, he'll also go to the Siwa Oasis and consult the oracle there. And this is where he gets the story that he's the son of Zeus Ammon. And this was an idea that he got from mother, from Olympias, that he actually has a divine origin. And then he's been so successful, he's had so many accomplishments on the battlefield, he begins to almost believe in this sort of like divine idea, this divine origin of his birth and his destiny. Around this time, so it appears that Alexander, he had kept these correspondences back with Greece while he was on campaign. He had been writing to Olympias. Back in Macedon, he left Antipater in charge as the regent, and then Olympias was this sort of major political player in the kingdom as well. And then one of the kind of foolish things that develops is the two of them, probably mostly Olympias, doesn't like what Antipater is doing, has all these disputes with him. And then Alexander, it appears he would write his mother and then try to calm her and try to say, listen to Antipater, what he's doing. These letters may have been an intentional part of his legacy and have been by design to sort of show his politics to posterity, but they don't survive to the present, which is unfortunate. This is a big artifact that we don't have anymore. So around this time, Darius begins to write Alexander and send him peace offers. And so one of his offers is, take half the kingdom, stop here, let's coexist with each other. And, many people in history would accept that deal. But Alexander refuses, and after finishing this sort of detour in Egypt, they depart and they head to Mesopotamia to resume their campaign. They go down the side of the Tigris River, and it's here where Darius has raised a truly sort of massive army, and he's going to confront Alexander at a big open battlefield, which is called Gaugamela. And the openness of the battlefield allowed the Persians to make full use of their army size. And in this battle, the Persians also had elephants, which the Macedonians had not encountered before, and which were very intimidating as well. So this is another huge battle. Same thing, the quality of the Macedonian military really prevails. It's going to be the same thing where Alexander will charge at the center where Darius is. Darius will flee the battle, and that will be this contributing factor that causes the Persians to rout. And so this is sort of the decisive victory of the Hellenic Age, and this causes the downfall of the Persian Empire, and then sort of this transition into Macedon. While this is happening, back in Greece, the Spartans lead a revolt against Antipater. So the one city-state that didn't join in the League of Corinth was Sparta. When Alexander was going through Asia, he would send things back to Greece, and he would say, he would title them, "This is a gift from Alexander and all the Greeks, except for the Spartans, and he would do that as sort of like a dig at them for not joining in this sort of pan-Greek coalition to fight the Persian Empire. So the king of Sparta leads this rebellion, and then Antipater puts it down. Alexander will make it to Babylon, and when he reaches the city, he's viewed as a liberator. And then Babylon will become basically the new capital city of the Macedonians. He then goes into Persia proper, following Darius. He'll reach the capital, which is called Persepolis, and then he'll burn the city to the ground, and this will sort of avenge the destruction of Athens by the Persians in the Greco-Persian War. He'll also visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great, and so he'll give homage to Cyrus, who he really admired. And then we have this other account of this battle, as the Macedonians are going into Persia. There's this fight in the Zagros Mountains, and it's a tale that really echoes the story of Thermopylae, and it's sort of an inversion of the narrative of Thermopylae. Now, at this point, having taken Persia itself, this is a vast distance that the Macedonians have already traveled, and they've already accomplished a tremendous amount. So one of the things that they do, or that Alexander does, is he starts to found these cities, these Alexandrias, as these Greek colonies in the east. He's going to keep going, continue to subsume, take over the rest of Persia, try to pursue and hunt Darius down. It appears that he didn't want to kill Darius, that he actually was trying to follow the example of Cyrus, and he wanted to actually keep him as a prisoner, make him into an advisor. But what will end up happening is, while they're hunting Darius in the east, his generals will betray him and behead him and send his body, send his head to Alexander, and so that plan doesn't end up, following through. At this point, it's such a transformation in the history of the world. He's so successful that he becomes almost a megalomaniac, and he starts to become convinced of his own divinity. And it was this ruler to whom, it seemed like anything was possible, and so it begins to affect him psychologically. So this is where there are ways you can interpret Alexander and his behavior and his legacy. Is he becoming more erratic? Is he becoming more paranoid? So to give you a couple of his sort of tyrannical events he does during this time. So there was a drinking party. It was called a symposium, and the army is drinking, and they're out in the east. And one of Alexander's commanders, his name was Cletus the Black, and Cletus had actually saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus. Starts to insult Alexander, and he's really drunk, and he says Philip was greater than you, and everything you've achieved is really the product of Philip. And this is seen as really humiliating to the king, and he kills him, and he throws his spear, and he impales Cletus. And then he regrets this after, he regrets this later. But this is one of those events where it's like, is Alexander starting to sort of go mad with power? Another thing is that there were these plots that were allegedly in the army, and so the son of Parmenion was this commander named Philotas, and he was accused of plotting to murder Alexander, and he was causing all this discord in the army. And so this causes Alexander to have this really controversial purge. He kills Parmenion, who had been this great general, this great ally of him and his father, and he kills Parmenion's sons as well as a part of this. As they go into the east and pass into modern-day Afghanistan and Central Asia, they subjugate this country, which at the time was called Bactria. And the population didn't want to come under Macedonian rule, and as part of one of these sieges, Alexander's hit in the head with a stone. So of course he's leading from the front. He's participating in the siege himself, trying to climb the ladders, and he appears to suffer from a traumatic brain injury, and he's really knocked out for an extended period of time. So this is another thing. So as he goes into the east, and he's accumulating all these scars and all these injuries, and does he have a traumatic brain injury, and is that also affecting him and changing his personality as well? And then another thing is the Macedonians had this huge culture of drinking. They were very heavy drinkers. And then it's also in response to war, the trauma of war. They're drinking constantly, and this is starting to affect their health as well. As Alexander takes Persia proper and sort of declares himself into the king of Asia, one of the things that made the Macedonians uncomfortable is he started to accommodate Persia, and he started to create this sort of syncretic imperial culture where he was trying to merge the sort of Greek culture on the one hand with the Persian culture on the other. And he starts to adopt or experiment with Persian customs. One of them is this custom of prostration, and it was this full body prostration one would do on the floor to the Persian emperor. And he tries this out with the Macedonians, with the army, and it's very unpopular. He begins to adopt Persian advisors. There was this one eunuch named Bagoas, so this is different from the Bagoas I mentioned before, and Alexander takes a big liking to him. And this was another thing that was sort of like the fearful Persification, Persianization of Alexander was a controversy that happened among the Greeks. They reach, to them, the edge of the world. They're almost reaching the boundary with China. They get to a place in Central Asia, which is called the Fergana Valley, which is this sort of fertile basin in the east, to the east of sort of the deserts of Central Asia. And that's where they found Alexandria Escate, or Alexandria the farthest. So after these campaigns in Central Asia, he goes into India. He has this battle with the Indian ruler. His name is Porus. And they reach, the furthest they reach in India is they reach the Beas River. And at this point, the army is exhausted, and they're basically on the other side of the world. And they turn against the king, and they say, okay, we don't want to go further. We've reached the edge of the world. We've reached our limits. And so they sail down the Indus, and then they return back to Babylon. So when Alexander returns to Babylon, he begins to try to administer this huge empire. He tries to send some of his veterans back to Greece, and they mutiny. And so he gives this speech. It's called the speech at Opus. And he sort of reminds them of all they've accomplished, all the things that they did under him and under Philip. And this settles the mutiny, and they retain their loyalty to him. He has this policy. It's called the Babylonian settlements, and he was basically going to take population from the west and move them east, population from the east and move them west. He tried to encourage intermarriage between the Macedonians and the Persians. So he would have like the Macedonian men try to find local noble women and marry with them. And then the idea here, he was trying to build longevity and create an imperial culture. At the same time, this was controversial, and so the Greeks looked down on the Persians. They viewed them as barbarians, and this was something that many of them didn't want to do. Alexander himself, he'll marry this princess from Bactria named Roxana, and then he'll marry an Achaemenid princess as well to try to marry into the Persian royal family. So he's only in this sort of administrative role for a really short window of time. And when he dies, he has this to-do list of these other sort of grandiose schemes that he has in mind. So one of his objectives, he wanted to conquer Arabia and integrate them into his empire as well. He wanted to build a great tomb to his father, to Philip. He had this plan to sail around Africa, to build temples, theaters, hospitals, to sort of urbanize the different Macedonian colonies, the different Alexandrias that they had built in the east, to sail to Gibraltar, to the Pillars of Hercules, to subjugate Carthage. And so when he died, and he'll die prematurely at 33, he'll pass away before having accomplished these last sort of grand schemes. So while in Babylon, this really sad event in Alexander's life will happen, and that's the death of Hephaestion, who was his best friend. And Hephaestion, it appears that he died of cirrhosis, so heavy drinking was a huge part of Macedonian culture, and as I said, they're drinking a lot because they're on campaign, and war is very stressful and traumatic. He actually goes to the doctor, who actually counsels him to stop drinking and to follow this sort of particular diet. And he actually recovers. There's a short window in which he recovers, but then he goes again to another symposium, drinks again, and then he passes away. So Alexander has this huge funeral to him, and it's this really sort of ominous, sort of like bad event in sort of the history of his life. While in Babylon, there are these kind of bad omens that begin to happen that are sort of mysterious and concerning. He loses his diadem. He loses his crown in one scene. And then there's this other account where he's sort of trying to go into the city, and then all these sort of sages and sort of fortune tellers come up to him and say, don't enter the city from this direction. It's a bad omen. It's going to cause these problems for you. And so these are the things that are sort of happening in the background prior to Alexander's death. The most likely event is that while in Babylon, he's bitten by a mosquito and he contracts malaria, and this is what kills him. Could he also have had a cirrhotic liver? Could he have had complications from traumatic brain injury? Those are other contributing factors, but this is the most likely cause of his death. When he dies, there's no clear heir to succeed him. So Roxana, his wife, is pregnant and will give birth to a son, Alexander IV, but he hasn't been born yet. And then there is this irony of how Alexander died, that he was basically unbeaten on the battlefield, but then he dies, ironically, of malaria. After the death of Alexander, Perdiccas, one of his commanders, is made the regent. And they come up with a compromise in the short term to sort of keep the empire together, to make the different generals into governors of the various provinces, and there will be a regency, and Alexander IV and Archidaeus, Alexander's older brother, will be the co-monarchs in charge of the whole thing. Unfortunately, this settlement doesn't last very long, and it will start to fray and start to come apart, and there will be all these mutual rivalries, mutual animosities between the different successors, and his empire will unravel and go to war with itself rather than politically consolidating. After Alexander dies, there's a revolt in Greece, and it's called the Lamian War, and it's led by Athens to overthrow Macedonian control. And so they corner Antipater, in the city of Lamia, which is where the name of the war gets its name from. And then the Athenians have these initial successes, but then the Macedonians come with all the new resources they have from this huge empire, and it's sort of a resounding defeat. And after this, Demosthenes commits suicide, and this is where his life ends after this final disaster. They try to transport Alexander's body back to Macedon, and this is the beginning of the funeral games. And this really turns into this sort of really brutal and outrageous sort of Game of Thrones, and these sort of brutal grabs for power that will happen amongst the successors of Alexander. So they're trying to transport the body. Ptolemy, who was the most prudent of the successors, he takes control of the governorship of Egypt. And while the body is being transported, he steals it. And this is one of the events that sort of causes a war to break out among the successors. For a time, they sort of maintain this pretense of keeping the empire together. Alexander's wife and his infant son, they live in Macedon for a short window of time, but then in the midst of this unraveling, they're killed. And so Cassander, who takes control of Macedon, or is in control of Macedon during this time, he murders Roxana, he murders Alexander IV, and then this is the end, basically, of the Argead dynasty. So you have Philip and Alexander and all they accomplished in their lifetimes, and then this was, unfortunately, the fate of their dynasty. Alexander, he was alleged to have this other one lover, this one mistress, and to have this illegitimate son, so they are killed as well. And basically his entire line and sort of the idea that this empire could be reunified through the blood of the original founder or founders is extinguished with this. These successors of Alexander, they eventually drop the pretenses. The most successful of the early generals in this sort of Game of Thrones that comes after Alexander dies, his name is Antigonus, and so he proclaims himself king in his own right. And then after that, Ptolemy and Seleucus and the others proclaim themselves king as well. Antigonus, so he will found what we call the Antigonid dynasty, is initially the most militarily successful, but he's sort of trapped between Ptolemy and Seleucus and sort of the other powers who become very jealous of him, and they end up defeating him in a major battle, and so that's sort of the end of his aspiration to unify the whole thing. After this, Seleucus, who is in charge of Babylon, is in charge of Persia and the eastern provinces, eventually becomes very successful. But then when he tries to go back to Greece and sort of add Macedon itself back into his territory, he's poisoned, and then that's the end of his aspiration to reunify the whole thing. If you know anything about the period after the death of Muhammad, how sort of his wives sort of would lead armies and sort of be in charge of their own militaries, this is sort of very similar. Anyone who was related to Alexander, who was associated with Alexander, they had that same kind of prestige and that same sort of sacrosanct quality. So in this sort of Game of Thrones that follows his death, Olympias will be in charge of armies with all these plots and conspiracies. She'll start assassinating people at court before eventually the people turn on her and they stone her to death when the powers sort of shift. And then Alexander's sisters as well will be in charge of states and armies, and these various generals will try to marry with them to try to get the legitimacy of being related to that Macedonian bloodline. So ultimately, so we call these successors the Diadochi, and they will squander their power and the potential for this Macedonian empire fighting amongst themselves instead of keeping it stable and keeping it unified. And it's interesting because this could have been a Greek version of the Roman Empire had Alexander lived or if his dynasty had remained in charge, but that didn't happen. This is still the beginning of what we call the Hellenic Age. There's this huge cultural flourishing. All these Greek settlers go east and found cities and found kingdoms. There are these Greek kingdoms in the east, in India, which will survive for an extremely long period of time. And then in Egypt, you'll have this period of Greek Egypt. And they'll build the famous lighthouse of Alexandria. They'll build the Library of Alexandria, which was this great center of learning. And so this is part of Alexander's legacy as well. So it's a really interesting tale of these two figures. They had this huge world transformative accomplishment in a really short window of time. And it's this really important formative event in the history of Western civilization. And it's regrettable that they didn't secure their succession, that the empire was not able to remain stable, and that the empire unraveled after the death of Alexander the Great.